We will now proceed to the next item on today's agenda, which is the oral question to the Commission, situation of rule of law and fight against corruption in the European Union, specifically in Malta and Slovakia. The first to speak as the author, Mrs. in 't Veld, for 5 minutes. And we, of course, will also see, and we already see, Commissioner Jourova in her place, and I think that colleagues will also pay respect to those that will now speak. Colleagues, if I may ask you, make the best of your moments of glory outside the hemicycle. Thank you. Mrs. in 't Veld, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Commissioner, dear colleagues, it's a pity that the Council isn't here, because I think the Council should be part of this debate here today. And before I'm going to go into the oral question and the resolution, I would first like to remind again what started this or what triggered this whole process, and that was the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, Jan Kuciak, and his fiancée Martina Kuznirova. And I think we should always recall their names and make sure that they're not forgotten. We are discussing today the oral question and the draft resolution that we will vote on later this year, and it has been drafted together with all the main political groups by the Rule of Law Monitoring Committee, and it is the result of almost a year, 10 months of hearings, on-site visits, meetings, correspondence, video conferences with governments, with the police, public prosecutor, journalists, NGOs, experts, farmers, and many, many more. And I think that if we look at the text of the resolution as it is today, it focuses on Malta and Slovakia, but not exclusively. It is, on the one hand, yes, it is highlighting concerns and criticisms and shortcomings. But I'm happy to say that it is also welcoming and noting some very positive developments, and I think the lesson that we can draw from this is that Europe works. It is clear that the intervention of the European Union helps the member states coming back on track where they risk running off the tracks when it comes to the rule of law and fundamental rights. The resolution makes a couple of recommendations which are also summarised in the questions to the Commission. We have some specific recommendations to Malta and Slovakia. One concern is actually a recommendation to the European Commission, inviting the European Commission to start a rule of law dialogue with Malta. We think that that would be justified. At the same time, I also intend to put forward amendments recognising the fact that the Maltese government has now announced that they will implement the recommendations of the Venice Commission. But nevertheless, I think a dialogue would be appropriate. We would also recommend that the brain behind the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia is caught. Not just the people who committed the murder, but also the brain behind it. And we also have a general call to end the scheme of golden visas and golden passports, not just in Malta, but in all the member states. With regard to Slovakia, we note that the probable brain behind the murder has not only been caught, but also charged with, amongst other things, the murder of Jan and Martina. And I'm happy to say that further inquiries into corruption and connections with organised crime are being conducted. Nevertheless, some concerns remain concerning the so-called system of revolving doors. We see some of the people who stepped down actually coming back in other jobs. And we would also urge the Slovak government to end the deadlock in the nominations to the Constitutional Court and to refrain from adopting the new media law. And finally, there are some general recommendations to all of us. First of all, it has become clear to me in the course of the work of the Rule of Law Monitoring Group that we need to strengthen Europol, because now Europol can basically only do its job when it's invited by the member states. And then people will say, yeah, but that's subsidiarity. But we also see that when public authorities themselves are engaging in wrongdoing, then we should have the means as European Union to come in. Why? Because we are a system altogether. If one of the member states undermines the rule of law, if one of the member states doesn't apply our common rules and standards, then basically the whole European system is broken. So I think we have every reason to strengthen that system and strengthen Europol. I would also call on the Commission to reinstate its annual corruption report, because we don't feel that the current formula in the European semester is strong enough. And finally, we would urge the Commission, in particular Mr. Timmermans, who's not here today, to finally respond to the repeated calls of the European Parliament for a comprehensive mechanism, the so-called DRF Pact, the Democracy, Rule of Law, Fundamental Rights Pact. And I see that both Spitzenkandidaten, Mr. Weber and Mr. Timmermans, neither of them is really committed to a comprehensive, non-political, objective, I'm finishing, Chair, mechanism, and the member states only want a peer review mechanism. I would really hope for the Commission.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I think it was absolutely clear. Madam Commissioner, you have the floor.
Mr. President, honourable members, the European Commission fully shares the commitment of the European Parliament and its Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs to ensure respect for our common European values. The Commission has taken action by initiating for the first time the procedure set out in Article 7 of the Treaty in relation to the actions of the Polish government. The European Parliament initiated the procedure in relation to the actions of the Hungarian government. The Commission has used its role of the guardian of the treaties by launching a number of infringement proceedings related to the rule of law. All EU member states are monitored by the Commission in the context of the European semester. In 2019 country report on Slovakia stresses in particular that long-standing concerns regarding the independence of the judiciary remain largely unchanged and do not appear to have been addressed. The 2019 country report on Malta underlines that recent reforms have not fully ensured the independence of the judiciary, as also confirmed by the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe. And I agree that we have to continue the dialogue with Malta, and we will do so. The European semester assessment also increasingly priorities fight against corruption. This is important for our economy and society. Since 2015, Slovakia received recommendations on fighting corruption on a regular basis. The Commission raised concerns about the accountability of the police and the low number of criminal prosecutions, as well as the insufficient protection offered to whistleblowers. As to Malta, the Commission is concerned about the lack of efficiency in handling high-profile corruption cases at both levels of investigation and prosecution. The Commission addresses these recommendations on a yearly basis with both countries. Let me now turn to the safety of journalists and media freedom. As regards safety of journalists, the Commission stands firm on the protection of freedom of expression and media freedom. Democracy cannot survive if journalists are no longer able to report freely, if they are intimidated, harassed, threatened, or even killed for doing their job. It is crucial that the masterminds of the assassinations of Daphne Caruana Galizia and Jan Kuciak and his fiancée Martina Kušnírová are brought to justice. Law enforcement and police investigations into individual crimes remain an individual member state competence, but member states have a number of obligations when investigating such crimes. They also have positive obligations to create favourable conditions so that freedom of expression can be effectively exercised. And I have to repeat again, exactly what I offered both to Malta and Slovakia, that our agencies, Europol and Eurojust, are fully available to support the investigation of those horrible cases. Now let me turn to the investor citizen schemes and investor resident schemes. As regards investor citizenship and residence schemes in the EU, the Commission adopted on the 23rd of January 2019 a comprehensive report. As a next step, the Commission proposes to set up a group of experts from the Member States to look into the specific risks that arise from investor citizenship schemes. This group will develop by the end of this year a common set of security checks for investor citizenship schemes. The Commission intends to present in June an initiative on further strengthening the rule of law within the Union. To prepare this, the Commission intends to adopt a communication on the state of play and the possible next steps for further strengthening the rule of law in the Union, with the objective to consult all institutions and interested parties. The work of the European Parliament is particularly relevant to feed the reflection on the future initiative. The Commission will take due account of the resolution on an EU pact on democracy, the rule of law and fundamental rights. In this context, it will also consider proposals, including those relating to the use of possible peer review mechanism on the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. We will now proceed with the speakers on behalf of the political groups. First to speak for the EPP group for 1.5 minutes, Mrs. Metsola.
Thank you. I am proud of my country. I am proud of the Maltese people and that we are part of the Union of Values of the European Union. I am proud that I come from a small country with an important history that has given a contribution to history. This is what makes us Maltese. Our size was never an obstacle because our potential cannot be limited by geography. We worked hard and we managed, and we did so because our determination comes from our integrity. The character of the people of Malta and Gozo is what marks us out, and we've had to fight to hold this identity, and we faced down all scenarios of people who ironically now find themselves in this very parliament, because we know that, and as we know now, that we are Maltese, we are Gozitan, and we are European. Maltese values are European values, and we must be clear. The assassination of journalists should never be tolerated. Corruption is not acceptable. Impunity and injustice should be fought always. This is what I promote and defend always. And this is the spirit of this resolution, that it should give how things should do in the future. This is what I will always do. I am part of politics because I have a belief and I have principles, and I will continue doing this by speaking in the name of the Maltese people.
Mr. Wiedenholzer, you have the floor for 2 minutes.
Danke, Herr Vorsitzender. Rechtsstaatlichkeit und
President, rule of law and fundamental rights are essential for people to feel safe and secure, and corruption and the political arbitrary is exactly the opposite of what we want to see for citizens. Individual member states, it's not that we are meddling or interfering, it's a pan-European responsibility which is incumbent on us. And we must make sure that the basic informing principles are being respected. And Article 7 procedures are now underway. Of course, that's too late for Daphne Caruana Galizia and for Jan Kuciak, who were after the criminal elements in their countries. The process of elucidating these crimes, the legal services and the judiciary in the countries have got an important role to play. To see if this is systematic violation of human rights in both countries, there are structural problems. And the Venice Commission, of course, is a very useful source here. We're talking here about the added value of Europol. Unfortunately, there are legitimate doubts as to whether the necessary consequences will be drawn as regards independence of the judiciary and the freedom of the press. And we must keep our eye on the ball, because rule of law is an important principle. We have a mechanism, or rather the Parliament has been calling for a rule of law mechanism, and this has to be a top priority. The Commission's position there is not entirely clear, and it's important that they should also keep their eye on the rule of law ball. Thank you.
The CR Group for 1 minute, Mrs. Ruohonen-Lerner.
Kiitos puhemies. Transparency Internationalin korruptioindeksin mukaan.
Thank you. According to the Transparency International Index, Slovakia is the 6th most corrupt European country and Malta the 8th. It's important that we speak out against fraudulent behaviour, and investigative journalists have a role to play in that. I want to express my sorrow about what's happened in these countries. It's important to clarify the events surrounding the deaths of the journalist, and that goes before the courts. It's important as well that the necessary steps are taken by the authorities in order to make progress with the investigations. In the parliamentary committee here, we've been dealing with these issues and also issues to do with the investor citizenship schemes as well. There are many risks associated with this, corruption, lack of security and criminal activity as well. And that, of course, it runs counter to our values.
Thank you. The
loss of the rule of law, democracy, and the undermining of fundamental values in some member states in the European Union is particularly worrying. It strikes at the very heart of Europe, because Europe has never been a question of maximising the interests of members, but a community of values, and that's why it's so decisive that all member states do stick to these principles. And it's right, therefore, that we finally get a rule of law mechanism, because all member states will investigate, and there will be an independent committee of experts set up to investigate whether the rule of law, democracy and the fundamental rights have been upheld. And if that isn't done, then that must bring about consequences, particularly in the context of the coming multi-annual financial framework. And if more money is to be spent and you've violated the rule of law, then you wouldn't be allowed to make those decisions. That would be up to the European institutions to make that decision.
Group for 1 minute, Madam Spinelli.
Grazie.
President, this mandate of the Parliament has shown us that the rule of law is under threat, and the journalists are risking their lives and limb. And this is one of the many contributions of the Parliament on this topic. However, monitoring presupposes that our role be neutral, and it must never be prompted by electoral incentives or marked by double standards. The purpose is to reinforce the institutions without seeking to substitute ourselves for them. And I'm afraid that this is not entirely or satisfactorily covered or respected in the resolution. Let's remember our role and make sure that it's above reproach, because the danger otherwise is that European institutions are going to be regarded as being Orwellian, and the rule of law is going to be seen as an external imposition which can be ignored. Thank you.
Group for 1 minute and a half, Mrs. Ferrara.
Thank you very much. The persistent lack of ability of the European Union to tackle the phenomenon which undermine the rule of law in certain member states, for example in Malta and Slovakia, has been flagged up by the Parliament in the past. Other European Union institutions have taken steps. For years we have been saying that we need to set up European Union monitoring mechanism in order to tackle violations of the rule of law. But every time that we ask the Commission which measures it intends to take, given the shortcomings when it comes to the independence of the judiciary or the poor efforts made in combating crime or protecting journalists, we don't get the answers that we want. There's also the whole issue of investor citizenship schemes and residence permits, which have turned into goods that can be traded. However, the investments involved are not always properly monitored, and that's why we need specific rules in order to protect the borders of the European Union against criminal activities. We need to focus on preventing and tackling these kind of phenomena, and that's why we need measures such as those in the Italian Spazzacorotti law, which tackles the different kinds of activities that we're talking about here and focuses on transparency in the financing of parties.
Pán predseda, chcem podporiť túto rezolúciu, ktorá nie je mierená proti občanom Malty alebo Slovenska, ale...
Thank you. So we support this resolution. It does not fly in the face of the interests of the citizens of Malta or Slovakia. Quite to the contrary, it is about the practices engaged in by the governments of those countries. It's a question of all regions having to stick to democratic mandates. Now, we were very shocked that in Slovakia there was the murder of a journalist and his fiancée. We were even more shocked once it emerged that the mafia had been involved with certain persons within the government and that the murder of further personalities was contemplated, such as lawyers or the former Minister of Justice. This then led to demonstrations throughout the country. Tens of thousands of people went into the streets to campaign and demonstrate against corruption. And so I would like to thank the European Parliament for the fact that we are able to stand here on the side of the people. There's one thing I would like to bring to people's attention. The European Parliament has for a long time, via the Petitions Committee of this House, called for something which has been ignored, and this is collective guilt or responsibility. The 20th of September 2007 in the Slovak Parliament a resolution was adopted, and I would like to make sure...
Madam Smolková, one and a half minutes.
Pekne za slovo. Pred rokom sme bezprostredne po vražde novinára Jana...
Thank you, President. A year ago, immediately after the murder, we expressed our conviction that law must prevail. And it seems to me that a year later, a year down the road, 5 people have been charged with having committed this murder. And Prime Minister Pellegrini said a week ago just how important it was to combat corruption, and the Slovak government has, when it comes to combating corruption, there is now a proposal on the table which looks to the standards which are upheld across the European Union. However, it's not just Slovakia that corruption exists and must be tackled. The statistics speak a very clear language. The European Union loses $1 billion in tax avoidance, and the tax havens, that's where we should be looking, and that's how to begin with combating corruption. And can I thank you, Commissioner, for your visit to Slovakia. Thank you.
Next for 1 minute, Mrs. Dechovsky.
Vážený pane předsedající, vážená paní komisař.
Mr. President, Madam Commissioner, I have repeatedly visited Malta and Slovakia this year and last year, and I was horrified by the number of cases where the European regulation and legislation was ignored. Citizens of Malta and Slovakia are hoping that the EU will help them to fight for the things for which the two journalists lost their lives. Corruption and lack of functioning of the rule of law. Let's not pretend that this is not well known. It is well known, and as MEPs, as EU representative, we have to be tough. We cannot compromise, not just in investigating these crimes, but also when setting better rules. The EU must not be a toothless machine which ignores certain excesses, but as an organization demanding detailed investigation and rules that prevent a case like this from happening again.
1 minute and a half.
Issues about the rule of law are being used to advance polarized and biased interests arising from national politics. Factually incorrect and skewed accusations are being made about Malta so that so-called inquiries could be launched. Repeatedly, investigations of this type sought to tarnish the image of the island. Proceedings of the monitoring group in the LIBE committee of this parliament conducting such an investigation were opaque and arbitrary. One of the key members is also a key member of the opposition party in Malta. How can we pretend to be advocates of the rule of law when we allow far-reaching value judgments to be reached by a self-elected and non-transparent group of members? Malta is well able to assess and reform its democratic functioning while fully respecting the rule of law. That covers all areas of crisis. Last Friday, the Maltese government has committed to making legislative changes reflecting the recommendations made recently by the Venice Commission on governance issues. Personally, I believe that there was no need to make such a quick commitment. The changes need to be discussed in Malta, amongst the Maltese, with the Maltese, and not with biased members of this House. However, surely the government's decision is a clear sign, all by the dubious standards of this House, that Malta is and will be fully respectful of the rule of law. I ask you, all members of Parliament, to face the facts with honesty. Thank you.
President, Madam Commissioner, I categorically denounce the killing of journalists in Slovakia and Malta. What happened in these countries is unacceptable. It runs counter to the European values and rules. We, from the EPP, we strongly denounce these killings and we insist on proper investigation. We demand that all truth be revealed to society, and also the masterminds behind these crimes should be exposed and brought to justice. The journalists in the European Union should have the freedom and they should be allowed to reveal the crimes that take place. I do not agree with those who put Bulgaria on this list as a country where journalists are killed, because there has been no such a case in Bulgaria.
That brings us to the KHDI procedure. First to speak is Mr. Faria for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. The European Union is a community based on law, democracy and the rule of law. However, in certain member states, these principles are not worth the paper they're printed on. Investigative journalists pay with their lives when they speak out about concerning the weaknesses of democracy or abuses of power in their countries. That's the price paid by Jan Kuciak, who was killed because he spoke out about the relationship between organised crime and the upper echelons of of corruption, of politics rather, in his life. The same for Daphne Caruana. And so far we haven't seen any proper investigations into her death. We are here to speak out against what's been done by the Polish government and by Mr. Orban, but that shouldn't mean that we turn a blind eye to what's going on in other countries, combating corruption, money laundering and so on. These are realities in these countries, and these are promulgated by the investor citizenship schemes which exist in my country as well. It's an open door for criminality.
Għalija pajjiżi min-nistiegħu huma l-aktar ħaġa importanti.
For me, on Thursday we are going to have to vote. This Parliament is being asked to vote on this resolution saying that Malta doesn't care about the rule of law. The irony is that this Parliament is focusing on a fact where in Malta today we have a government which is putting forward amendments on the basis of the proposals by the Venice Commission to amend laws. I am happy to say that where I see that amendments are going to be put forward, because the resolution as it is at the moment does not give a clear picture of what is happening. The Commissioner mentioned the judicial appointments as an example of where things haven't been done as well as they could have been. However, more reforms are being carried out where constitutional amendments needing two-thirds majority is needed, as was sent to you in a letter to you. These are reforms of a law which the preceding government, which was part of the PPE, did not address in 25 years.
Senhora Comissária, falou no papel dos whistleblowers. Peço-lhe que siga de perto o que está a passar-se com...
Thank you, President. We talk about the Europe of values, but look at Rui Pinto, who is in prison in my country. And after the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, I think it's unacceptable that those behind the crime have not been arrested, and that those who were the perpetrators, Joseph Muscat is giving orders to the public prosecutor and to the authorities, and this is why there are amendments being moved, as described by Mrs. Dalli a moment ago. Everything suggests that it's the mafia manipulating the government which is behind the murders, and it's unacceptable that Joseph Muscat should continue to protect the corrupt mentioned in the Panama Papers and continues to protect the murderers of Daphne Caruana, and that her children can continue to be persecuted by defamation cases.
You ran out of your time. No. Mrs. Gomes, this is not respectful to your colleagues who are waiting for their time to speak. Mrs. Dalli has a blue card question. Do you accept? Thank you, Mrs. Dalli. Go ahead, half a minute.
Thank you. Since I was mentioned in an incoherent speech, which I couldn't even follow, I would like to ask my colleague to kindly specify more clearly if you are against these reforms, because that's what I'm understanding from you.
So, Mrs. Gomes, please.
All reforms that can indeed ensure the separation of powers and the rule of the law. And that's exactly the reason why they are not there. These are not being respected, and that's the reason why the investigation on the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia is blocked, and that is outrageous. And I hope that anyone serious like yourself would be against that.
I see that you have a lot to say to each other, and I would recommend maybe just to take it offline outside the hemicycle. Thank you, Mrs. Beňová, for 1 minute.
Ďakujem, pán predsedajúci, bude to teraz náročné. Vážený pán predseda, pani komisárka.
Thank you, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. This is already the second report on the situation in Slovakia and Malta, and as we had in the previous debate, I would like to express the fact that I think it's a great shame. It's terrible that Jan Kuciak, Martina Kushnerova and Daphne Caruana died. This is a tendentious report. I've constantly been in contact with the rapporteur about things that are not in the report. I'm going to mention them now. In Slovakia, investigations have been opened very rapidly in conjunction with all relevant agencies, as mentioned by the Commissioner, and those responsible have had charges brought against them. I think it's a shame that in East and West Europe there is a cleft, and we see criticism about the rule of law going in one direction.
From Mrs. Infeld, do you accept, Mrs. Benoit? You do. Mrs. Infeld, half a minute for you.
Look, I've heard your criticisms. I've heard them before. I think they're unfounded, and I wasn't going to react. But I would really like you to clarify the last statement about how this resolution indicates that there is a rift between Eastern and Western Europe. I have always maintained that there is no Eastern Europe or Western Europe or Central Europe or Northern Europe or Southern Europe. There's only one Europe, and that is what I have been working for the last 15 years. And I don't accept your statement.
Mrs. Benoit, you have half a minute to respond.
Veľmi jednoduchá odpoveď. Hovorila som to v
A very simple answer to that. I was saying it in the context of the fact that every month a member state in Eastern Europe is being criticized. The Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and most recently Slovakia. And it's always the same thing. But it doesn't bring about good cooperation between member states. You've been talking about fighting corruption. Some time back, we were talking about the Netherlands. We were talking about a country in which the courts were in trouble.
Komisaria Jourova, Slovakia and Malta.
Slovakia and Malta are two member states which are represented here in the Parliament, and they deserve our respect. But no state should escape the focus that this Parliament has put on combating corruption, and that means ensuring pluralism, judicial independence, and so on. There have been 2 journalists who have been murdered, and that shows the need for Slovakia and Malta to do their utmost to meet the needs of the Interpol inquiry. It's also important that we look at these investor citizenship schemes. They allow money laundering to take place, monies coming from criminal activities, and it's also important that we ensure that there is transparency and that whistleblowers are protected when they speak out about these kinds of offences. Well, that's why it's essential, and we've said this to the Prime Ministers when they've appeared here, it's essential that Malta and Slovakia clarify what happened, these murders.
May I ask you to take the floor and respond to the debate?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. President, honourable members. This has been a very important debate because it covered several existentially crucial and important topics. We speak about rule of law, we speak about media freedom. We didn't speak so much about the necessary space for the civil society, which is also part of the same thing. And whenever we see the worsening of the situation in some member state, we see that it usually refers to all these 3 pillars which we should pay attention to. I will stay more now with the rule of law principle and the mechanisms the European Commission uses to uphold and monitor the rule of law in the member states. As I said before, we use the whole toolbox and all the instruments available. We launched for the first time Article 7. We are covering this important issue in European semester. We use infringements where possible and where needed, and also we use something which I didn't mention at the beginning, and it is the justice scoreboard, which is a very useful yearly benchmarking exercise which shows, among other things, how the people, the citizens and the businesses in all the countries grasp and perceive the independence and quality of judiciary system. And we are also newly adding the criteria of how the fight against corruption is done in the member states. So these are all the toolbox or the instruments we have in our toolbox. Now let me say a few words about the new initiatives. As I said at the beginning, we plan the communication on the rule of law to clarify what we mean by rule of law, that it is not purely the member states issue, that it is the European issue which has been covered by the recent case law by the European Court of Justice, which will be fully reflected in our communication on rule of law. Another initiative is the linking of rule of law with the new budget. I think that this should be also mentioned here. We also adopted the new initiative, the protection of whistleblowers, and last but not least, the European Public Prosecutor's Office, which should start working from 2020, is a very important contribution to fight against corruption and fight against financial crime related to EU money. A long list of initiatives. We need to enforce the law, we need to bring all these initiatives to life, and we need to explain to the citizens in the EU why we are doing that, why it is very important. I spoke about the need to uphold the rule of law and to do and to run all these initiatives from the side of the European Union. At the same time, as the citizen of the Czech Republic, I would like to add that maybe I feel a similar thing to some of you, that we should trust more the people living in our countries, our member states, that there are democrats, that they have in hands the way how to solve the problems. They should not be put aside. We should trust them, and we should trust the active citizens. That's why I also mentioned the civil society organizations and the active citizens who raise the voice and who express their dissatisfaction if something wrong is happening in their country. I am not calling for demonstrations, I am not calling for riots. I just say we should trust more the people living in our member states, because they are democrats and they know what to do. Among other things, to go to the elections and vote for democratic powers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. The debate is closed, colleagues. The vote will be held on Thursday. We will now proceed to the next item on the agenda, which is the report by Mrs. Ulvskog, discontinuing seasonal change of time. And I will hereby ask Madam Rapporteur to take the floor for 4 minutes.